welcome back to another episode of the Good Advice Podcast. You're tuning in to the best resource for business owners, entrepreneurs, and people just looking to find some new insights in the business world. All of that is here on today's episode because we have one of my favorite kind of podcast episodes. We have a round two conversation. This is where we bring back not just one of my favorite guests, but one of your favorite guests. And today we're bringing someone back from one of the top downloaded episodes ever. We have John LaGue joining as the COO of CoPilot. John's friend Matt Spatel, who's the CEO of CoPilot, joined the podcast a few years back. It was the #1 most downloaded episode on the show for quite a while, and John is looking to get back in the ring with a little round two conversation. Now, if you don't know much about CoPilot, it is an amazing exercise and personal fitness app. They just raised $6.5 million in Series A funding just this last year. It's pretty incredible seeing how much it has grown, and we're going to be talking about growth in the podcast today. How can you grow your business in meaningful ways, including a little conversation about influencer marketing? All that and more is on today's episode. Check this out, but before we dive in, we do have a word from one of the amazing businesses that are so kind to sponsor the podcast. Check out this quick ad. We'll be right back soon. There's one single piece of advice that I give to business owners who are ready to scale their business drastically. And that's knowing exactly what you need to hand off so that you can continue focusing on what you're an expert in. It amazes me when I talk to business owners who are doing their own bookkeeping and tax prep, and worse, that they're going through all of this paperwork at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, even midnight, slaving away trying to make sense of all of the numbers for their business. Business owners who are making it happen have already figured out that you can't do it all yourself. That's why I recommend Steve Lay with Equity Business Solutions. Not only is he an expert in bookkeeping and tax prep, but what I love about Steve is that he'll sit down with you and help you make sense of the value of your business beyond just reading a spreadsheet. You'll be able to make better decisions, and more importantly, you're going to save yourself the crucial time you would have spent going through QuickBooks or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever it is that keeps us up late at night. So save yourself some time and some money by giving Steve Lay a call at Equity Business Solutions, and he'll show you the value beyond your numbers. Go to equitybusinesssolutionsllc.com to find out more. John, it's so great to have you on the podcast today. A returning, I was going to say returning guest, but returning company on the podcast for a second time. So thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Well, and it's a little awkward because I'm very much into the dad bod. I try to avoid exercise as much as possible. And it seems like with CoPilot, you guys are really, you're saying making a difference sounds so much simpler than what you're actually doing. But I see some of the stuff you guys post on social media. It's pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, it is very exciting to be a part of the company, or part of a company that is truly impacting people's lives. I always kind of joke with people that one of my favorite things about working here is getting to see some of the testimonials, and it almost feels like the testimonials are fake, like we're paying people to make these things about how much we changed their lives and how like they were in such a dark place and we kind of helped them work through that. And knowing that those are completely real is always very nice, especially when it's been a rough week. So,
what's funny though, is as you build your tribe, like people really do become like huge junkies for your product, or like just ravenous about what you're selling. I posted something yesterday. I do this thing on Tuesday mornings for local entrepreneurs to be able to come and just like share some insights, because there's not a lot of events like that aren't like paywalled or like sales crazy. And I posted about it yesterday, and one of the people who's an attendee basically wrote and said like, yeah, it's exhilarating to be able to go to it. And I was like, wow, exhilarating.
That's awesome.
I would definitely sell myself much shorter, but it is funny though, like as you pick up those customers or users or what have you, who they genuinely enjoy your brand. How did you get to that point? Let's start with the first loaded, explain it all in the next sentence.
Yeah.
How did you get to that point?
It happened overnight, as these things do. No, it's definitely did not happen overnight. it was definitely a long path. And there's by no means does everyone love love Copilot, and there's definitely a spectrum. For some people it works really well, and for some people it's not the right fit. But yeah, it's a long journey. So I guess kind of just starting at the beginning. I'm technically not one of the original co-founders of Copilot. That would be Matt and Gabe, two really smart guys from MIT and Carnegie Mellon here in Pittsburgh. But they started a company that was solely focused on building hardware devices. So they were trying to build a wearable watch that you could wear while you worked out, and it would track all of this really cool data about your workout, so you wouldn't have to keep track of it yourself. Because they were huge nerds, still are huge nerds, and also really into fitness.
I think when Matt came on the podcast, he talked about like his StarCraft days, like playing the game StarCraft. And I was like, this is such an interesting, this has never happened on the podcast before. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, he got me into StarCraft too. Yeah. So that's part of the story too.
That's so funny. I love that.
But yeah, it's a good team bonding. But
yeah, sure. Or very toxic, whichever way you look at it. Sorry, we're getting way off track. Continue, please.
Yeah. So they started this hardware company, or mostly just an idea, something for themselves that they wanted to build to track their workouts. And they started sharing it with people and realizing, okay, maybe this could be a business. Maybe people would buy this wearable device. They had this really hacky kind of watch thing, and they were collecting some cool data. But what they quickly learned is, one, building hardware devices is really hard. And so they kind of pivoted to using just Apple Watches and putting their software on Apple Watches. But they learned that this data they were collecting, while it was really cool and interesting for people to look at, and it made things a little bit easier when they were working out, it wasn't really solving a huge problem or a painful problem for people. And so they were like, okay, what can we do with this data that would be solving more of a problem? And that's when the idea of bringing in an actual expert, a personal trainer who could look at all of this information, sift through it, synthesize it, and apply it to your future workouts would be very valuable to people. And so they brought on personal trainers, and at that time, that's pretty much when I joined the company, when they were launching officially their remote one-on-one personal training service with all of this cool workout tracking information as well. So that was yeah.
Sorry, I was just saying there's such like a gap in like knowing how to read data well. I got into it back when I was a school teacher. We were talking about like difference in test scores. And one of my coworkers was like, well, the person leading the meeting was like, hey, these numbers are different. And the person leading it was like, or the person sitting next to me who's very smart was like, well, they're not statistically different. So like we're having like a whole conversation about what one teacher's doing versus the other when they're basically the same score. And the person leading the meeting was like, they're different numbers. Like I can physically see it. And there was this back and forth. Well, finally, my coworker was just like, all right, whatever, but so you're bridging the data deficit with not just someone who can understand the data, but, and here's what I love about what you're doing with the Copilot, someone who like functionally understands like from a firsthand perspective. It's not like, hey, I understand the data, now let me connect you with the trainer. It's, I understand the data and I am the trainer, so I can tell you exactly what you need to be doing next.
Right, exactly. Yeah, data itself is a whole language. And so being able to communicate that effectively is definitely a skill, and understand it. But yeah, so that's when I joined the company, which was January of 2020. And the story around that is also a little interesting. I won't go into the details, but I was looking for a job at the time, and I was in the startup space already. And I saw a posting by Matt and Gabe online. It was like one of the first positions they were hiring for. They were looking for someone to help them grow, and also looking for someone to help them on the data side. And my background is in data science. That's what I went to school for. But I also have experience helping startups grow and on the marketing side. And so I kind of just shot them a message saying, hey, I can do anything. Like, let me help out. And they responded. We had some interviews. We got to know each other. And within like a week or 2 weeks of that message, I was moving into their apartment and living with them. So that's kind of how I joined the
You
company.
guys went full on like Silicon Valley, like
Exactly.
we're gonna
Yeah.
live
We
together.
really,
Okay.
really went into it.
Okay. Now you were positioned, you and I have chatted a little bit about this, but you were positioned to do the marketing, to grow the app, to grow the user base, which sounds like a very simple task. And yet, we know it's a very challenging is not the right word. I mean, it is challenging, but it's much more complicated than it sounds. For starters, I mean, there's tens of thousands of apps out there. So you're in this whole pool of apps. You're trying to pick up users for people who you're not physically engaging with. Like, it's different from a sales perspective when I meet you in person and I say, hey, listen to the podcast. And, I guilt you to feel awkward enough to download it in front of me. You can't really do that with an app. So talk to me, like, what was your approach? Like, how did you approach this thing? Like, what did you do?
Yeah. Yeah. So that is like the crux of the question with any startup, anyone starting a business. It's like, how do you, like, you can't just build it and they will come.
Right,
you really have to.
A lot of people think that, though, right?
Yeah.
Like the ego. I mean, I think you're obviously much more in the startup conversation than I am. I'm more like fringe, like meeting people who are in the startup world. And I do run into people where, it's like, oh, it's Facebook, but it's better. And I'm like, okay, yeah, you're going to, and no, not against anyone,
Right.
but I'm like, okay, we're talking like $1 trillion company. Like, you have the better, I mean, we all hate Facebook, but you get it.
They put millions and millions of hours effort into fine tuning it.
It makes me think of, I don't know if you ever watched Parks and Rec, but I can't think of the guy who like gets fired or he quits or something, but he shows Rob Lowe his claymation thing that he spent like all day, and it's like half a second. I think that is like the startup world. A lot of times it's like you have this grand idea and then like you slave away for hours and hours and hours, and you're like, this is what I have, like, after all this time. So but I'm getting like, I'm totally like taking us into the random world here. You had this app, you had this program that you wanted to get people enrolled into. Where did you start? What did you do? Yeah.
So it's definitely a difficult question. And I will put it out there that you need something that is actually valuable to be selling and growing. That is definitely kind of stage one. By no means do you need a perfect thing to be selling and marketing. But specifically for people in this startup world, having something that is actually solving a pain point is an important thing to have in mind too, before trying to throw like ad spend at something. You do want to iterate a bit on that and make sure you have something that's worth like really, really growing.
Well, and I think that's I think it is step one, but it's also like a really painful, challenging starting point, because like, how do you navigate? I think what I have is valuable, even though it's not. Or I think I'm solving a problem, even though I'm really not. Like how do you parse this as a founder? Like, you have your idea, in your heart that it has merit, and yet, like, is there any way to like make this less of a guessing game? Like, how do you really make sure that people, they do see value in it?
Yeah. So I two books that I always recommend to anyone who like asks me about startup journey. The first one is The Mom Test. Super short book.
We've talked about it on the podcast. It's a great one though. Yeah,
it's a great one. And then I believe it's Traction, the Bullseye Method by Gabriel Weinberg, the founder of DuckDuckGo. Both of those are my two go-to books, because they kind of answer both of the questions that we're talking about here. So the first one is like, how do you validate the idea? And the Mom Test is really good for that, just by talking to people to see if there's really a pain point that you're uncovering, and if you're solving it with your solution. But how do you really know if you're actually solving something is, okay, are people going to pay me for this solution that I have? Or are people going to use it so incessantly, like Facebook, that it's so clear that it's something valuable to them, and then I can monetize that in some other way? But Yeah, those two books are kind of the foundation for how I approach and how I have approached growth at CoPilot and at other startups.
Mhm.
So
So
yeah, I don't.
yeah, and I think it's great advice. And for our listeners, without getting too in the weeds, this is, by the way, if you're not in the startup world, these are still incredible books, especially the Mom Test, which its premise is basically, if you want to know if you have something valuable, don't ask your mom. Ideally, ask your customer, your end user, what they think about it. So this works for any of us who are selling anything, but so John, you definitely, that's step one. You approach this with the mentality of like, how do I make sure that I'm ultimately asking people to engage with something of value? And then where did the marketing go from there?
Yeah, so especially in the early days, like we didn't have much money for marketing or doing any big campaigns or anything like that. Very, very lean operation. We're all living in an apartment together. How do you get people to use this app? And it was also 2020. And so March, we literally launched on March 1st. And then 2 weeks later, everything was shut down. But that's where I kind of turned towards the book Traction. And it really is my playbook, and kind of walking through what that book outlines. It's a very simple process that you can do in any type of business. And I encourage everyone to go through these exercises. You don't even need to buy the book. I think the author, he's made some Medium articles online that literally outline all the important stuff. So just Google that and you'll see a nice outline that tells you exactly what to do. And I literally did these step by step and was able to actually get some traction and get growth. But the ultimate goal is to find, okay, how can I find a channel or some area where I can acquire customers reliably at a cost that is worthwhile for my business? And so this book is all about how to find that channel, how to find that source. So in the book, there's an assumption that there are effectively 19 different types of channels that you can use to acquire customers. And so those channels are kind of broad categories like offline marketing or online marketing, speaker events. And so he kind of puts everything into these 19 different buckets. And my process is, okay, we have these 19 different channels. And so I sit down and I literally just make a spreadsheet where each tab is a different channel that could be a way for us to get customers. And within each of those tabs, within each of these channels, I'll go through and I'll literally just list out as many ideas as I can think of for what could I do within this channel that could potentially get me in front of people, get me talking to people, or get me an actual customer. And so I would just list out as many ideas as I could for every single channel. And then kind of create a hierarchy of how I want to go through and test all of those ideas. So the three questions that I use to evaluate these channels or these tests and which ones and decide which ones I want to start first are one, how many potential customers could I get from this channel or this test? So like maybe I can get one person, but is this a reliable channel for me? Am I going to get more customers from this? The second one is, okay, what is the cost to acquire a customer? And that cost can be in my time, my effort, or just in actual sort of ad money that I'm putting in or spend that I'm putting into that channel. And then the final one is this the type of customer that I actually want? Like, is this person going to get value from my service? Are they going to love my service? Are they going to tell other people about my company or my product? So those are the three questions. And I kind of, before I start doing anything, after I've kind of had this big brainstorming session for every single channel, and I'll note it is important to really do it for every single of one of these 19 different channels. So a lot of small businesses and startups get very fixated on a certain on certain types of ways to grow their company. Like we all know that Facebook ads is a thing, and they're very, very easy to set up. Like you just need a credit card and a website.
You'll spend it very quickly.
Yes, you will spend money very, very quickly. And so everybody knows that's there. Same with Google ads, but most people will try those ads at some points because they're very easy to do and very accessible. But
yeah, and I mean, I think about, I was talking to someone the other day who he was like, it's so funny how it's like so casual too. I was talking to someone, he was like, yeah, and then I went ahead and boosted my post on Instagram. And I was like, okay, wow, good for you. That's great. But it is very accessible, very easy to do. But I didn't mean to interrupt you though. Continue.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's just showing that most people will go for those easier things, those lower hanging fruit that we all know about. But it's in very important exercise to really walk through every one of these 19 different channels and really brainstorm as many ideas as you can within each of those, even if that channel isn't something you're familiar with, even if you're not an expert at all in that, or if you've never seen anyone else in your space or industry use that channel before. Like if you're a mobile gaming app, most people are probably using some sort of Facebook ads or in-app ads on other games. And so you might not think of, okay, maybe direct mailing. If you're a mobile gaming app, you might not think of sending out mailers to people as a channel that's worthwhile for you. But I would say it's definitely worth at least the exercise to go through and list out all of those things in all of those channels, even if you might not initially assume that it would work for you, because you might be surprised at what actually does work and what is an underutilized channel within your space or within your niche. So brainstorm as many as you can within each of these 19 sort of channels. Again, just if you want to know what those channels are, I would Google the full list so you don't have to listen to me rattle them off in the podcast. You just named 19.
Yeah. Well, but like, I love this too, because there's two things I really like that you're doing is one, it gets rid of like the personal bias. Like you mentioned, like people who just are naturally drawn to a certain channel or, and it's not even like personal bias. Sometimes you have people who are just like so vocal, like, oh, you got to do, like, I actually got myself in a awkward situation with a new business owner where I was giving him some advice and someone nearby was like, well, you got to do advertising. Like, you just got to throw in like, $1,000 into advertising. And I was like, he doesn't even know what he's selling yet. Like, chill out, but so you're getting people telling you what you should do also. So I love your sort of it sort of naturally lends itself to this more unbiased approach. How do you account, like, and tell me if this is like included like in the cost to acquire, but like, I'm thinking like the nuance of like time to acquire. So like at like a speaker event or like at a networking event, typically those take longer to acquire someone because it's much more personable. But those can be more, in terms of like repeat business, those can be much better for your business long-term versus someone you acquire quickly, but the tie to your business is so much more surface level. Do you navigate those kinds of like complexity, or is that included in one of these questions? Or or in the app world, is it all about just like, let's just keep, pumping the numbers? I mean, pumping is malicious. I don't mean it that way. I mean, growth at all costs, but just very curious like how you navigate it.
Every channel definitely is different. And you might have a speaking event or something like that, and then you don't actually get a customer from that for several weeks later. Maybe they leave and then they go and they start listening to the podcast. And then it's on week 3 of listening to the podcast that they actually end up, becoming a customer or something like that. It's harder to account for that in this initial stage when you're just going out and you have nothing. I would say go for the things that are going to get you faster results.
Yeah. Cash. Or
just
recurring
someone
revenue.
using your product or service.
Yeah. And that qualifier helps me with my next question too, because I was thinking, this is very like acquisition of users or revenue focused. When does the conversation of brand come into play? But what you just said, we're talking starting out, like getting those first users, brand really comes later. So
Yes.
I don't even have a question
At
other
least
than you answered the question.
Yeah, for me, I've always advised people to not worry too much about brand. And people kind of have a few hesitations there. One, they're worried that they're going to have this tarnished brand if they do a certain thing and it doesn't turn out well, or if they put some sort of ad or some sort of marketing test out there and they don't feel like it's quite on brand. I would definitely say, one, most people don't care. Most people won't know your brand. Most people won't even notice. And so you're not as locked into things as people initially feel like they are. And it is totally okay to change. Our brand has changed literally at the highest level. We used to be called Delta Trainer, and now we're
Right.
CoPilot. So things can always change. Getting that initial revenue and that also very important feedback and information from your customers is so much more valuable to me than the brand level. There's definitely some instances and stories where people go out to the market with a super strong brand and they crush it. And it's all about brand from the start. And so I don't want to say that is the only way, but for so many people, just actually taking action and testing things is going to be way more practical to get some traction early on than worrying about creating a perfect brand and a perfect product and then launching it all at once.
Yeah, and I think where I've seen that come out or come into play with like new entrepreneurs is people who get it's paralysis by analysis on like, my brand. And by the way, for the listeners, I'm totally not knocking you guys who sell like the branding kits and stuff. Like, good, I'm happy for you. I will say though, the founder who is agonizing over the brand colors and spending like day in and day out instead of like you said, John, like getting out there and like selling basically, or like working on those channels. And I love your advice. I totally agree that, early on, and this is more for like the scrappy entrepreneur, that cash flow is so important. So if you're not focused on bringing people in, converting people to sales or users, you're going to have a really hard time. So
yeah,
we're
all
actually,
about
go ahead.
That core value, just delivering that core value.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're actually already like towards the end of the call, and I feel like I have like 10,000 questions. So if you will allow me one more question, one thing that I know you've found a lot of success on is influencer marketing. And I'm so curious about this because I feel like in some worlds this works really well, and in other worlds it's kind of a meme. Like, it's like influencer marketing, and I've actually seen some like really funny like videos that kind of like spoof off of like, when you hire an influencer, like what can you expect? But you've utilized this and you have found some great success with it. I just so curious, like what does that look like for you? Like navigating that? Anything you can share on that?
Yeah, so I guess I'll be relatively brief, but going into one aspect we didn't talk about of the 19 channels is just like trying a bunch of tests, and most things will fail. So that's very important to know going into all of those. Is a lot of the stuff you do is not going to work out, and that was true for us on most things, including influencers. When we first kind of went out and tried them, we sponsored some influencers to talk about us, and we didn't really get anything in response, or maybe we got like one person to try out the service when we put in, hundreds of dollars, and we're expecting a lot more. What happened for us is we got kind of lucky in our second attempt, because also part of that whole 19 channels testing process is iterating on what you learn and just trying a bunch of things over and over. But what we've found, how we've gotten it to work at the highest level is, it sounds very simple, but just looking for people who are truly authentic. Usually when people think of influencers, you think of that Instagram model who is super attractive and not at all approachable or something like that. That is not the type of influencer that we would be working with. We are looking for people who have a large reach, so they have a large audience, but they're also very much relatable people. I mean, you have an audience on this podcast, but you're also, seemingly, to me at least, a very relatable person.
I try to do.
And so those are the type of people that we're looking for at the highest level. Like, how do we get it? We have a very defined system for finding that authenticity and giving them the tools to talk about us in the right way. But it definitely was not an immediate success with influencers. It took some testing, and influencers sometimes, still to this day, definitely, they don't all work out. So there is kind of a Pareto principle, that 80-20 rule, which I actually heard of recently on one of your podcasts, the junk removal one. He was talking about that. So that also applies to influencers. So there's a lot that fail still.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And man, I wish we had more time. This is the second time you guys have come on the podcast. Your first podcast, I'm actually going to be airing it for our listeners. You can dive into the what's the word? The vault of episodes to track down. It is named CoPilot, actually, with Matt Spittell or Spittell. I actually don't remember.
No.
Yeah. Thank you. So this will be the second one, but then also for our listeners, we're going to be re-airing that episode in the coming weeks because little secret spoiler, I haven't been sharing this with people in terms of what the top 10 are, but y'all's episode you were in that top 10 of the most downloaded episodes in the 5 years of the podcast. So you guys who were listening, you actually be able to hear that first episode in the next several weeks. So John,
well, I'll have to compete with Matt, and
he's got a head start of a couple of years. So man, John, this was so good. I so appreciate you finding the time to join me today and giving some just really great practical advice on the show. I so appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it as well. And if you want to grow your company, the best way to do it is to just go to mycopilot.com, get a fitness coach. That's the best place to start, is getting a fitness coach. But no, I thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Of course. All right, for our listeners, I'm going to put the link to that down in the episode description below. And if you've been listening to the podcast and you enjoy the podcast, what the heck are you waiting on? Click the subscribe button and the follow button so you can keep getting good advice wherever you are. Don't forget, if you want to support the podcast, we have a couple ways you can do that. If you're a business, you can advertise on the podcast, which you can reach out at blake@goodadvicecoaching.com, or you can jump on our Patreon. If you want to skip those ads, you can jump on the Patreon and support the podcast for as little as $5 a month. Thank you so much to our partners who help support the podcast. We really appreciate it. All that to say, that's today's good advice. We'll catch you later. See ya.